20,000. Just let that staggering number sink in for a single second. To actually reach that absolute mathematically impossible milestone, a man would have had to successfully charm and win the unquestioning devotion of 1.2 different companions every single day without taking a single day of rest, starting all the way back in his early high school years. We are talking about a towering titan who absolutely dominated the sports world until the early 1970s. He achieved a deafening success that most mere mortals can only dream of. But his most unbelievable, jaw-dropping record had absolutely nothing to do with a leather ball. In a scandalous autobiography, he boldly confessed to this massive number, a fatal choice that sent absolute shockwaves through the entire country and shook the very foundations of the entertainment industry. The reaction from the public was absolutely explosive. Conservative America gasped in sheer outrage, furiously condemning his blatant disregard for traditional values. Yet, behind closed doors, in the quiet corners of exclusive clubs and dimly lit bars, countless men whispered in deep, secret envy. How was it physically, emotionally, and psychologically possible to live such an exhausting, relentless double life? Newspapers plastered his bold claims across their front pages, instantly turning a legendary, fiercely respected athlete into the most notorious playboy of the 20th century. But the dark side of fame always demands a heavy, often unbearable toll. As the sensational headlines slowly faded and the initial shock wore off, a much darker, far more intriguing question began to emerge from the shadows of his towering legacy. Why would a man who already possessed the absolute, unwavering adoration of millions feel the desperate, almost pathetic need to broadcast his private conquests to the entire world? Was this truly the ultimate alpha male boasting of his undeniable, magnetic power? Or was it a brilliantly constructed smokescreen, a desperate illusion designed to hide a profound, agonizing emptiness inside his soul? Today, the secret is revealed, and the truth behind his bravado is far more heartbreaking than the boastful myths he so carefully created. To truly understand this giant's insatiable, never-ending appetite for romantic validation, we must look far back into the past, long before the perfectly tailored suits, the roaring engines of luxury cars, and the blinding spotlight of fame. We have to travel back to the rough, unforgiving, and often cruel streets of Philadelphia in the 1940s. It is a deeply personal detail that his aggressive promoters and PR managers desperately tried to erase from history. But the truth always finds a way out of the darkness. As a young child, the man who would become an unstoppable physical force was shockingly frail. He battled severe, life-threatening health issues, including a terrible bout of pneumonia that kept him confined to his small bed for months at a time, staring at the ceiling and listening to the other kids playing outside. The local doctors whispered quietly to his anxious parents in the narrow hallways, expressing serious, heartbreaking doubts about whether he would ever grow up to be a strong, capable man. Imagine the sheer suffocating terror gripping a young, fragile boy's mind, feeling entirely helpless and incredibly small in a tough neighborhood where any sign of weakness was an open invitation for relentless bullying and cruelty. That early, deeply rooted fear of being physically fragile planted a dark, twisted seed deep within his developing psyche. It ignited an obsessive, burning desire to never, ever let anyone look down on him again, both literally and figuratively. When nature finally intervened, triggering a sudden, explosive growth spurt that rapidly pushed him to a staggering, unbelievable height of over 7 feet and 1 inch, he did not just embrace his new size, he weaponized it. His towering muscular frame became an impenetrable, intimidating armor against the terrifying vulnerabilities of his sickly childhood. This psychological overcompensation bled into every single aspect of his reality. He simply had to be the biggest, the strongest, and the absolute most dominant figure in any room he entered. And it was exactly during his high school years, as his unprecedented athletic prowess began to draw breathless, amazed attention from everyone around him, that he discovered a new, incredibly potent way to validate his worth. The sudden, overwhelming, and flattering attention from young women offered a powerfully intoxicating remedy for his deep-seated childhood insecurities. Every romantic victory, every stolen glance became a shiny new medal, a tangible, undeniable proof that the sickly, helpless boy from Philadelphia was gone forever, buried under the weight of a rising superstar. This insatiable hunger for validation soon propelled him far out of his hometown, throwing him headfirst into a whirlwind of international temptation where all the normal rules of society simply ceased to exist. When he joined a world-famous exhibition basketball team, his life instantly transformed into an endless, dizzying carousel of glamorous international flights, luxurious five-star hotels, and wild, unchaperoned nights that stretched into the early morning hours. This was not just a typical sports tour, it was a grand, unrestrained traveling circus of temptation and absolute indulgence. Suddenly, the young giant was no longer just a local hero making headlines in his city newspaper. He was a global sensation. He was paraded across grand European capitals, exotic locations, and sold-out arenas, treated like royalty wherever he went. Far away from the strict moral codes and watchful eyes of his homeland, he found himself entirely surrounded by an atmosphere of absolute, intoxicating freedom. Whispers from those wild, reckless days paint a vivid picture of legendary celebrations behind heavily guarded, thick hotel doors where the expensive champagne never stopped flowing and the exclusive guest lists were filled with stunning, eager admirers willing to do absolutely anything to get close to the phenomenon. Those closest to him during that chaotic, glittering era noted a distinct, undeniable shift in his behavior. He was no longer just passively enjoying the attention that came with his fame. He was actively, relentlessly hunting it. He began collecting romantic encounters with a chilling, almost mechanical efficiency, treating his personal life like a secondary scoreboard that he desperately needed to run up. It was during these relentless, exhausting overseas tours, amidst the endless, blurring parade of anonymous admirers and fleeting hotel romances, that he forged his infamous, unbreakable personal rule: he would never, under any circumstances, get married. To his deeply guarded mind, committing to one single partner felt like a suffocating prison sentence, a terrifying limitation on his hard-won freedom and his absolute power to conquer. Why on earth would he ever settle for a quiet, predictable domestic existence when the entire world was practically throwing itself at his massive, size 16 feet? He convinced himself that a man of his unparalleled stature and legendary appetite required a constant, never-ending supply of new conquests to maintain his sanity and his status. But the wild nights in Europe were merely a warm-up, a simple practice run for the ultimate neon-lit playground of sin and glamour that was patiently waiting for him back in the United States. Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a glowing, neon-lit oasis of absolute temptation, completely distinct from the harsh, freezing winters of the East Coast. When our towering giant finally touched down in sunny California, he was no longer just a phenomenal, highly respected athlete. He was a bona fide superstar stepping directly into the golden age of Hollywood extravagance. He quickly and effortlessly infiltrated the highly exclusive, heavily guarded inner circles of the entertainment elite. We are talking about velvet-roped, shadowy VIP rooms where flashing cameras were strictly forbidden, and scandalous, career-ending secrets were traded like the most expensive currency. It was in these exclusive, smoke-filled luxury lounges that the dark side of fame truly embraced him, wrapping him in an intoxicating illusion of absolute power. The rumors echoing through the hushed, velvet-lined corridors of power connected his name to some of the most famous, devastatingly beautiful actresses and top-tier models of the entire era. These were names so incredibly powerful, so universally adored by the adoring public, that mere mortals were absolutely terrified to speak them out loud in connection to his controversial, sprawling reputation. He collected these star trophies with a relentless, almost mechanical drive, turning his personal life into an exclusive, glittering red carpet event that never seemed to end. It was whispered that powerful studio executives constantly worried about his undeniable magnetic pull, terrified that their leading ladies were risking their pristine public images just to be seen entirely captivated by his towering presence. He drove custom-tailored imported European sports cars that roared dangerously through the winding canyon roads, wearing incredibly expensive bespoke suits that perfectly draped over his massive 7-foot-plus frame. Everything about his public persona was meticulously designed to project an image of invincible dominance and unimaginable wealth. Every single night was a carefully orchestrated display of his status, surrounded by a swirling entourage of eager admirers who hung onto his every word. He was living a breathtaking, intoxicating fantasy of absolute control, wrapped securely in a lifestyle of endless, dizzying celebration and profound privilege that most men could only dream of experiencing for a single day. But to maintain this unprecedented, exhausting level of glamour and absolute secrecy, he needed a fortress. He required a heavily guarded private sanctuary where his deepest, most extravagant desires could unfold far away from the prying, judgmental eyes of the relentless public and the aggressive tabloid reporters. This constant pursuit of romantic validation required immense, draining energy, and he was building a massive wall of glamorous trophies to protect a deeply hidden, lingering vulnerability. This desperate need for absolute privacy and unchecked indulgence led directly into the creation of his ultimate, scandalous masterpiece hidden in the hills. And so, he built himself a sprawling architectural marvel completely hidden away, high up in the exclusive, sun-drenched hills of Bel Air. He proudly and fiercely named this massive custom-built estate the Great Bear, a perfectly fitting title for a luxurious, impenetrable den designed specifically for a relentless, towering predator of hearts. This was not a traditional, warm family home filled with quiet evenings. It was a jaw-dropping, multi-million-dollar playground meticulously engineered from the ground up for a single, lifelong bachelor with an endless, insatiable appetite. The sheer scale of the property was meant to intimidate and impress simultaneously, a physical manifestation of his massive ego. Every single square inch of the sprawling mansion screamed absolute indulgence and breathtaking extravagance. But the master bedroom was the true crown jewel of this palace of passion. Let us pull back the heavy curtain on the astonishing hidden details. The room featured a legendary, custom-made bed that spanned an unbelievable area, practically swallowing the entire enormous space. It was heavily covered in luxurious, incredibly expensive furs, resting perfectly beneath an enormous, flawlessly polished mirrored ceiling that reflected every single secret movement. This room was not built for peaceful rest. Every inch of it was brilliantly engineered for absolute luxury and relentless romantic pursuits, a grand stage for his nocturnal conquests. But the real scandalous secrets were hidden much deeper within the incredibly thick, soundproofed walls. Dark, persistent rumors constantly swirled around Hollywood about hidden electronic mechanisms, secret, dimly lit passageways, and heavily guarded private rooms designed for highly exclusive, invitation-only gatherings. The heavy, imposing iron gates of the Great Bear only opened for a carefully curated selection of the most stunning, glamorous women in the entire country. It was a completely sealed, perfectly controlled ecosystem of temptation where he ruled as an absolute, unquestioned monarch, dictating every term of engagement. What truly happened when those heavy mahogany doors locked heavily from the inside? It was a hidden world of pure, unadulterated fantasy, a gilded cage built with endless wealth. Yet one has to deeply wonder about the psychological toll of such a fiercely guarded existence. As the loud, pulsing music finally faded into the early morning hours, and the last luxurious car drove quietly down the winding driveway, the deafening silence of that massive, empty palace remained. Did that quiet, vast isolation ever force the giant to confront the agonizing, cold reality of his own profound, unshakable loneliness, surrounded by mirrors but no true companions? While his incredibly long nights were completely filled with velvet-draped, scandalous adventures, his days were strictly reserved for absolute, terrifying athletic dominance. The contrast was absolutely jarring, almost impossible to comprehend. No single story perfectly captures this bizarre, exhausting double life, quite like the legendary rain-soaked evening in a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania. It was there that he achieved the truly impossible, a staggering, mind-boggling athletic feat that remains entirely untouched and completely unparalleled to this very day, scoring exactly 100 points in a single, grueling professional basketball match. The entire sports world stood in absolute breathless awe, calling it the greatest individual performance in the long, storied history of human competition. It was a display of physical power and absolute endurance that seemed entirely supernatural to anyone watching from the stands. Reporters scrambled to find the right words to describe a man who simply could not be stopped by multiple defenders, a force of nature that effortlessly shattered every preconceived notion of human limitation. For decades, it stood as a testament to his unparalleled dedication and supreme athletic conditioning. But the scandalous secret revealed decades later painted a far more shocking, completely unbelievable picture of that historic, magical night. You see, the night before this grueling marathon of physical endurance, he did not rest. He did not sleep peacefully in his quiet hotel room, carefully preparing his mind and massive body for the punishing challenge ahead. Instead, reliable witnesses and close, trusted confidants later whispered that he spent the entire, exhausting night thoroughly enjoying the intimate, uninterrupted company of yet another beautiful, captivating acquaintance. He arrived at the crowded arena practically straight from a romantic conquest, his eyes heavy with absolute exhaustion, having consumed exactly 0 hours of sleep. He simply laced up his heavy shoes and walked onto the wooden floor to make global history. How does a human heart withstand such relentless, punishing extremes without completely giving out? Was it a bizarre, unexplainable genetic anomaly that fueled his towering frame? Or was it a burning, deep-seated psychological fire that simply refused to let him rest, constantly pushing him to prove his undeniable superiority over every single mortal man on Earth, no matter the devastating cost? While his incredibly long nights were completely filled with secret passions and scandalous, velvet-draped adventures, his days remained the ultimate arena for absolutely ruthless, terrifying athletic dominance. However, on this shining, golden Olympus of sports, he was not standing alone, and it was exactly here that the most exhausting, intense psychological duel of the 20th century unfolded. His main, uncompromising rival became a man whose very name still commands absolute awe among sports fans, the legendary Bill Russell. This was not just a simple, everyday rivalry between two phenomenal athletes. It was a colossal, grinding battle between two completely opposite, irreconcilable life philosophies. On one side stood our towering giant, completely obsessed with his personal statistics, individual greatness, and an endless, exhausting parade of romantic victories. On the other side stood a quiet, incredibly focused man for whom the ultimate team triumph always stood far above any personal ambitions. The striking, almost frightening contrast in their lifestyles was constantly and hotly debated in the hushed, smoky corridors of sports arenas. While his main opponent led the quiet, disciplined life of a model family man, methodically building defensive tactics and studying his rivals, our hero turned every single away game into a grand, unrestrained, wild celebration. Sports critics of that golden era quietly whispered among themselves, asking the exact same agonizing question: How often did this incredible, unsurpassed talent lose to sheer, grinding persistence simply because the giant's mind was occupied by something entirely different? Vicious rumors confidently claimed that even during the most crucial, high-stakes final playoff series, he was secretly planning massive, exclusive private parties that were scheduled to begin the very second the final whistle blew, completely regardless of the final score on the board. This all-consuming, blinding egocentrism, this burning, desperate desire to always be the single brightest star in the entire universe, cost him incredibly dearly in terms of his professional legacy. His own exhausted coaches were frequently driven to absolute, pulling their hair out despair, vainly attempting to force him to play for his partners, to share the leather ball, and to divide the glory equally among the roster. His teammates often felt like nothing more than faceless, temporary background extras in his grand, never-ending solo performance. He genuinely, honestly, could not understand why they were so frustrated, especially since he was bringing them unbelievable points and setting phenomenal, untouchable records. But in the most decisive, heart-stopping moments, when maximum cohesion and a willingness to sacrifice everything were desperately required, this huge, invincible colossus suddenly found himself entirely alone against the perfectly synchronized, well-oiled machine of his bitterest competitors. Why exactly did the most perfect physical specimen on the face of the planet suffer such offensive, crushing defeats from opponents who were far less gifted by nature? Modern sports psychologists tend to believe that his deep subconscious simply could not withstand the colossal, inhuman, terrifying pressure that he voluntarily hoisted onto his own massive shoulders. It was absolutely vital for him to prove his unquestionable superiority every single passing second, and any missed shot or lost game was perceived as the immediate, catastrophic collapse of his entire artificially created universe. But even when his professional athletic career finally reached its inevitable conclusion, his gigantic, demanding ego forcefully demanded a brand new, even more massive stage for self-affirmation. And he effortlessly found that stage right where sweet illusions and harsh reality twist into a single, glittering knot in the very dark heart of the global film industry. The rapid, highly publicized transition from the gleaming hardwood floors of the basketball court to the dusty, chaotic backlots of Hollywood became an absolutely natural continuation of his grand, lifelong public show. Our towering hero did not just want to modestly test his abilities in front of a movie camera, he passionately, hungrily desired to instantly become the central, commanding figure in the most massive, high-budget Hollywood blockbusters. And then, as if by some twisted joke, a fateful choice brought him face to face with another man whose ego and ambitions were just as completely boundless: the unsurpassed, rapidly rising action superstar, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Their collaborative work on an epic, sword-swinging fantasy picture quickly transformed into a hidden but incredibly tense, boiling war for absolute dominance, a behind-the-scenes battle that still generates the most unbelievable, almost mythical rumors among veteran film crews. Terrified eyewitnesses whispered that the giant creatively used absolutely every single opportunity to publicly, undeniably demonstrate his unquestionable physical superiority over the famous Austrian bodybuilder. Right there on the crowded movie set, he would ostentatiously, with a light, mocking smile, lift unthinkable, massive weights with just a single hand, playing with them as if they were weightless feathers, openly challenging the recognized golden standard of masculine strength of that turbulent era. It was a constant, exhausting psychological game designed to wear his opponent down to the bone. The enormous, inflated ego of the former athlete simply could not physically accept the harsh reality that, according to the strict script, someone else was supposed to be the main, unsurpassed savior of the fictional world. He constantly engaged in heated, scandalous arguments with renowned directors, imperiously demanding that they rewrite entire scenes just so his character would appear even more powerful and completely indestructible. But the glowing movie set attracted him for reasons far beyond just the opportunity to flex his incredibly defined muscles in front of expensive rolling cameras. The extremely long, incredibly exhausting breaks between takes magically transformed into the absolutely perfect conditions for continuing his endless, scandalously famous romantic hunt. The luxurious, sprawling Hollywood sets instantly became his brand-new favorite hunting grounds. Rapid, dizzying on-set romances flared up with a frightening, almost machine gun-like regularity. Naive background extras, highly ambitious production assistants, and even professional makeup artists quickly became shiny new star trophies in his strictly classified, never-ending list. He incredibly masterfully utilized his dark aura of a mysterious, entirely unreachable legend, hypnotically charming women right in the short, breathless pauses between filming the most dangerous, explosive stunts. This entire multi-million-dollar cinematic epic was, in reality, just another incredibly expensive, elaborate way to maintain the sweet, intoxicating illusion of his eternal youth and his fading, magnetic appeal. He desperately, until his knuckles turned completely white, clung to the fading image of the tireless playboy and the invincible, towering warrior, categorically refusing to acknowledge the painful fact that time was mercilessly taking its heavy toll. However, the real, truly crushing blow to his carefully constructed, decades-old reputation did not come from harsh movie critics or envious younger athletic competitors. The ultimate catastrophe of his entire existence was triggered entirely by his own hands when he arrogantly decided that the entire world was finally ready to hear the shocking, unfiltered truth, and his darkest secret was finally revealed to the public. When his incredibly scandalous, highly anticipated autobiography suddenly appeared on the front shelves of popular bookstores in the early 1990s, absolutely no one could have even imagined in their worst nightmares the deafening success it would initially have, or the deafening, destructive explosion of pure outrage that would immediately follow its official publication. It was a truly fatal, completely irreversible mistake made by a man completely blinded by his own towering pride, a man who believed far too strongly in his own absolute impunity and in the blind, unconditional love of his gullible audience. He proudly, boldly printed that highly shocking number in black and white right on the pages of his book, 20,000 Women. But the historical timing for such boastful, completely inappropriate confessions was chosen absolutely catastrophically. The entire world was just beginning to realize with sheer paralyzing horror the massive scale of a new, rapidly spreading and terrifying global health crisis that was mercilessly taking away the best and brightest, forcing society to radically, completely reconsider its liberal, carefree views on casual, intimate encounters. The reaction of the deeply shocked public was not just simply angry, it was a brutal, absolutely merciless, public dethroning of a golden idol. The towering man who, for many glorious, shining decades, was considered the unquestionable idol of millions of young boys, the absolute benchmark of strength and dizzying success, suddenly found himself directly in the center of an unprecedented scandal due to serious allegations of total, unforgivable social irresponsibility. The very same press that had once enthusiastically sung his sweet, rapturous praises now ruthlessly, with undisguised vicious pleasure, tore his legendary reputation into tiny, unrecognizable shreds. He was openly and aggressively labeled a direct threat to civil society, a completely unprincipled, arrogant egotist who placed his endless, base desires far above the basic safety and well-being of everyone around him. The bright, glowing halo of the invincible giant dissolved entirely, without a single trace, into the acrid, suffocating smoke of universal public contempt. It was in this exact, agonizing moment that the dark side of fame completely swallowed him whole, pulling him down from his golden pedestal and throwing him directly to the angry, unforgiving wolves of public opinion. Realizing the true frightening scale of the impending social catastrophe, he began frantically, almost in a state of pure panic, trying to somehow fix the completely shattered situation. Dozens of emergency primetime television interviews quickly followed, where he nervously, with a very tight, unnatural smile, clumsily tried to pass the entire massive controversy off as one unfortunate, heavily exaggerated joke blown out of proportion by his greedy publishers. He swore on live television that this insane, impossible number was cited exclusively to attract the attention of passing readers, and that the gullible journalists had misunderstood absolutely everything. But his delayed, desperate excuses sounded incredibly pathetic and completely unconvincing against the heavy backdrop of long-standing, universally known rumors about his unrestrained, multi-day parties. The frightened society absolutely refused to forgive his blatant recklessness, and the elite doors that used to open with a snap of his fingers suddenly slammed violently shut. The towering, custom-built iron gates of his magnificent Bel Air mansion kept the relentless paparazzi entirely at bay, but they also effectively locked the giant inside a deeply isolating, glittering cage of his own brilliant design. To the outside observer, his sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate, affectionately dubbed the Great Bear, was the ultimate, undisputed pinnacle of the absolute American dream. It was a place where the expensive champagne flowed like a magnificent, never-ending river, and the highly exclusive guest lists read like a directory of the most glamorous, captivating women in the entire country. However, the dark side of fame has a cruel, almost poetic way of demanding a heavy, emotional toll from those who dare to fly too close to the blinding sun. When the loud, pulsing music finally faded into the early hours of the morning and the heavy mahogany doors closed behind the last departing luxury car, an absolutely crushing, suffocating silence descended upon the vast, mirrored halls. The secret is revealed through the quiet, deeply guarded testimonies of the very few individuals who were genuinely permitted to see beyond the carefully constructed, bulletproof public persona. His closest, most trusted friends painted a remarkably tragic, heartbreaking picture of a man who was absolutely surrounded by thousands of willing admirers, yet remained the most profoundly lonely individual they had ever known. Beneath the massive, intimidating physical exterior of the ultimate, unstoppable alpha male beat the heart of a highly sensitive, surprisingly fragile intellectual. While the tabloids viciously painted him as a one-dimensional, insatiable playboy, he frequently spent his completely isolated, sleepless nights buried deep in thick, complex volumes of classical philosophy, desperately searching for a profound meaning that completely eluded him in the bustling, superficial world outside his fortified walls. His paralyzing, deeply rooted fear of genuine emotional intimacy was perhaps his most closely guarded, terrifying vulnerability. He possessed an incredible, almost supernatural ability to effortlessly attract the physical attention of thousands, but he was absolutely, completely terrified of allowing a single, solitary person to truly understand his complex, heavily guarded soul. The staggering, unbelievable number of superficial conquests was, in reality, a towering, impenetrable fortress built specifically to keep true, vulnerable love safely at a massive distance. He sincerely believed that if he ever truly opened his heart, if he ever allowed himself to be emotionally dependent on another human being, he would instantly lose his legendary, invincible power and revert back to that frail, completely helpless boy from the rough streets of Philadelphia. This tragic, deeply internalized delusion of happiness within his mirrored, luxurious castle slowly became his absolute agonizing reality. He meticulously orchestrated a life of constant, dizzying motion and endless romantic noise, specifically to drown out the quiet, persistent whispers of his own profound isolation. Every single extravagant party, Every highly publicized, scandalous midnight rendezvous was merely another incredibly expensive, elaborate distraction from the cold, undeniable truth that awaited him in his massive, empty, custom-made bed. The deafening success he achieved on the polished hardwood courts and in the glowing Hollywood spotlight could never truly fill the vast, echoing void of a man who conquered the entire globe but completely forgot how to simply hold a hand in the quiet, comforting darkness. As the glittering, wild decades slowly turned, the unforgiving, relentless march of time brought a completely new, incredibly dynamic generation of rising basketball stars to the forefront of the global stage. For a man who had absolutely defined an entire golden era of the sport, stepping out of the blinding spotlight was not just simply difficult. It was an agonizing, completely unacceptable physical pain. The arrival of younger, faster, and highly skilled phenomenons, most notably the brilliant, unstoppable Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, triggered a massive, deeply bitter generational feud that absolutely captivated and divided the entire sporting world. Our hero, who was entirely accustomed to being the single, undisputed center of the entire universe, simply could not psychologically digest the harsh, undeniable reality that his magnificent, towering reign was finally approaching its inevitable twilight. Instead of gracefully, quietly transitioning into the respected, dignified role of a wise elder statesman, he made the fatal choice to engage in a highly public, incredibly messy war of words that severely tarnished his carefully curated, majestic legacy. He launched relentless, fiercely bitter verbal attacks against the new rising athletes, heavily criticizing their playing styles, their professional dedication, and their absolute right to inherit his golden, heavy crown. Every single time a young player achieved a monumental, breathtaking milestone, the aging giant would immediately, desperately, rush to the nearest microphone to loudly remind the global audience that he had accomplished it first, and supposedly much better. It was a tragic, almost pathetic display of an aging monarch, furiously, blindly clinging to the crumbling edges of his magnificent, slowly fading throne. This escalating, deeply personal conflict with his greatest successors was particularly vicious, fueled by a toxic, explosive mixture of professional jealousy and entirely opposing social ideologies. While the new, highly educated star athletes were deeply, passionately involved in serious, groundbreaking civil rights movements and profound social justice issues, our older hero was still desperately, loudly clinging to his fading, superficial image as the ultimate, carefree Hollywood playboy. The younger, incredibly focused generation viewed him not as a guiding, inspiring mentor, but as a deeply flawed, egotistical relic of a bygone, wildly irresponsible era. The resulting public clashes were absolutely spectacular, playing out on the front pages of national newspapers and in the tense, electrifying atmospheres of crowded television studios, exposing a deep, ugly rift that completely fractured the athletic community. Driven by a burning, desperate need to constantly prove his enduring relevance and undeniable superiority, he resorted to increasingly bizarre, highly controversial off-court antics. If he could no longer physically dominate the young, incredibly athletic superstars on the polished hardwood, he was fiercely, absolutely determined to completely outshine them in the vicious, sensationalist tabloid headlines. He deliberately orchestrated wildly extravagant, highly visible public appearances, surrounding himself with entirely new, even younger entourages of glamorous, starry-eyed admirers, practically screaming to the universe that he was still the ultimate, unquestioned king of the hill. But these frantic, exhausting efforts only served to painfully highlight his deep, internal insecurities, proving that the heaviest, most unbearable burden of immense fame is the terrifying, paralyzing realization that the deafening applause will, inevitably, stop completely. While the intensely bitter, highly publicized sports feuds consumed the front pages, an entirely different, completely hidden narrative was quietly, ruthlessly unfolding in the heavily shadowed, incredibly lucrative background of his post-athletic life. Beneath the charming, constantly smiling exterior of the legendary towering giant lay the cold, incredibly calculating mind of a brilliant, utterly ruthless financial predator. When the massive multi-million-dollar sports contracts finally ceased, he did not simply step away into a quiet, comfortable retirement like so many of his legendary peers. Instead, he aggressively, fiercely pivoted, building a sprawling, highly complex business empire that generated absolute fortunes, but also attracted incredibly dark, highly suspicious elements that operated far beyond the reach of the glaring mainstream spotlight. He heavily invested in a vast, highly secretive network of exclusive nightclubs, premium entertainment venues, and prime, incredibly expensive real estate scattered across the country, particularly in the bustling, notoriously complex heart of Harlem. These massive, cash-heavy investments transformed him into a powerful, incredibly influential titan of industry. But they also firmly placed him in extremely close, highly dangerous proximity to the criminal shadow of the underworld. Persistent, deeply unsettling rumors constantly swirled around his completely opaque, highly protected financial dealings. Whispers in the darkest, most exclusive VIP rooms suggested that his incredibly rapid, massive expansion was quietly backed by highly questionable, entirely silent partners whose identities were absolutely never spoken aloud in polite, law-abiding society. He frequently found himself in the center of a scandal due to serious allegations regarding the deeply shady, questionable characters who practically lived inside his highly exclusive, velvet-roped establishments. While other legendary, highly celebrated athletes were tragically losing absolutely everything to terrible, predatory investments and greedy, unscrupulous managers, he was fiercely, aggressively multiplying his massive wealth with a chilling, almost terrifying efficiency. He navigated the treacherous, incredibly dangerous waters of high-stakes business with the exact same ruthless, uncompromising aggression he once famously displayed on the polished basketball court. He was an absolute master of leverage, utilizing his towering, highly intimidating physical presence and his monumental, global fame to force incredibly lucrative, one-sided deals that left his stunned competitors completely bankrupt and absolutely powerless. But this massive, unregulated accumulation of staggering wealth and absolute, unchecked power came with an incredibly heavy, terrifying level of constant paranoia. The brilliant, custom-built Bel Air mansion was no longer just a luxurious, glittering playground for his endless romantic conquests. It slowly, inevitably, morphed into a heavily fortified, highly secure compound specifically designed to protect him from the very real, terrifyingly dangerous enemies he had accumulated in the unforgiving, cutthroat world of underground business. The man who had spent his entire spectacular existence desperately seeking the blinding, unconditional adoration of the entire globe had slowly, deliberately transformed himself into a highly isolated, deeply suspicious kingpin, surrounded entirely by people who were solely, completely interested in the massive, overflowing contents of his heavily guarded steel vaults. For decades, the sprawling, sun-drenched hills of Hollywood have thrived on deeply buried, highly scandalous secrets, but no single mystery has fueled more frantic, terrified whispers than the legend of his missing, unpublished diaries. Long after the massive, deafening success of his first highly controversial autobiography, persistent, incredibly detailed rumors began to circulate among the absolute highest tiers of the entertainment elite. It was quietly said that the giant had meticulously penned a second, far more explosive manuscript, a deeply personal, unfiltered archive that completely abandoned his previous, frustratingly vague descriptions. This rumored, heavily guarded sequel supposedly contained the actual verified names of the most famous, incredibly powerful, and highly married women who had willingly surrendered to his magnetic charm over his long, sensational decades in the blinding spotlight. The mere whispered possibility of this devastating manuscript existing sent absolute, paralyzing shockwaves of pure panic through the luxurious, heavily guarded boardrooms of major movie studios and the pristine, quiet mansions of powerful politicians. We are talking about highly influential, untouchable men who suddenly realized that their carefully constructed, pristine family images were entirely at the mercy of a towering, unpredictable retired athlete. The dark side of fame has always protected its absolute most powerful members, and the terrifying prospect of this monumental, catastrophic exposure forced the elite into a state of frantic, aggressive damage control. Private, highly paid fixers and incredibly ruthless lawyers were allegedly dispatched into the shadows, desperately searching for any trace of these highly combustible, explosive, handwritten pages before they could ever reach a hungry, waiting publisher. To this very day, the absolute burning question remains: where exactly are those highly dangerous, deeply scandalous archives hidden? Some deeply convinced conspiracy theorists fiercely argue that the diaries are currently locked away in an impenetrable, temperature-controlled subterranean vault, heavily guarded by the furious, incredibly wealthy descendants of the women he supposedly compromised. Others passionately claim that powerful, unseen forces orchestrated a massive, highly illegal raid on his sprawling Bel Air estate the very moment his heart could not take it, quietly confiscating every single piece of paper to permanently protect the fragile billion-dollar reputations of Hollywood royalty. The secret is revealed only in the terrified, anxious glances of those older, veteran celebrities who still absolutely refuse to ever mention his controversial name in polite, recorded interviews. But there is a far more brilliant, incredibly psychological theory that perfectly aligns with his massive, dominating ego. What if those highly sought-after, terrifying diaries never actually existed in the first place? What if the aging, incredibly calculating giant deliberately, masterfully planted those terrifying rumors himself, using the terrifying threat of total catastrophic exposure as the ultimate unbeatable leverage against an industry that was slowly, inevitably, trying to push him completely out of the golden spotlight? It would have been the absolute perfect bluff from a man who spent his entire spectacular existence treating everyone around him like highly expendable pawns on his massive personal chessboard, ensuring that he remained the most feared, incredibly relevant figure in town until his very last breath. Beneath the flawless, custom-tailored suits and the massive, intimidating physical exterior of the ultimate, unstoppable alpha male, a deeply tragic, completely hidden physical betrayal was slowly, relentlessly taking place. The human body, no matter how incredibly magnificent or seemingly invincible, is simply not engineered to withstand decades of absolute, punishing extremes, endless, sleepless nights, and the colossal, terrifying stress of maintaining a larger-than-life global persona. As he slowly advanced into his late 50s and early 60s, the towering, seemingly indestructible titan began to quietly, desperately battle a severe, incredibly dangerous heart condition. It was a terrifying, deeply guarded secret that he absolutely, categorically refused to share with the adoring public, terrified that any visible sign of physical frailty would instantly shatter his golden, carefully constructed myth. For the fragile, deeply insecure little boy from the rough, unforgiving streets of Philadelphia, who had spent his entire existence running frantically away from the terrifying shadow of physical weakness, acknowledging his failing health was simply not an option. He made the tragic, entirely fatal choice to stubbornly ignore the frantic, desperate warnings of his highly paid medical specialists, aggressively pushing his exhausted, heavy frame to its absolute breaking limits. He categorically refused to undergo the serious, invasive treatments that could have potentially extended his time, simply because he could not psychologically bear the humiliating, terrifying thought of the public seeing their beloved, unconquerable giant resting helplessly in a sterile white hospital bed. His massive, legendary pride became his absolute worst, most dangerous enemy. The heartbreaking, deeply emotional contrast between his glittering public facade and his agonizing private reality was absolutely staggering. Whenever the flashing, blinding cameras of the relentless paparazzi were heavily focused on his towering figure, he would immediately, instinctively straighten his aching back, flash his famous million-dollar smile, and completely project the aura of a man who still effortlessly owned the entire universe. He continued to surround himself with stunning, incredibly young admirers and actively participate in highly visible, exhausting social events. But those few highly trusted individuals who saw him behind the heavy, locked mahogany doors of the Great Bear witnessed a completely different, profoundly sad story. They saw a heavily breathing, rapidly aging man who frequently needed to rest his massive frame after simply walking across his luxurious, mirrored bedroom. This was the ultimate agonizing tragedy of his completely uncompromising, rigidly constructed identity. He was absolutely trapped inside the massive, impossible legend of his own creation, essentially forced to play the exhausting, physically draining role of the tireless playboy long after his magnificent steel motor had completely worn out. He lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear that if he ever finally admitted he was just a vulnerable, mortal human being, the entire world would instantly, mercilessly turn its back on him. And so the giant stubbornly, silently suffered in his massive gilded cage, desperately trying to outrun the undeniable, rapidly approaching reality that no amount of staggering wealth, absolute power, or countless romantic conquests could ever permanently defeat the slow, quiet march of time. The absolute, unthinkable reality finally struck the entire globe on a quiet, seemingly ordinary day in the month of October in the year 1999. The massive, sprawling Bel Air mansion, which had spent decades serving as the ultimate beating heart of endless, scandalous Hollywood passions and grand, legendary celebrations, suddenly fell entirely, completely silent. The towering giant, the man who had single-handedly rewritten the absolute limits of human athletic potential and unapologetically lived one of the most controversial, heavily debated lives in modern history, had finally departed this world. As he lay resting in his enormous custom-built bed, the very same heavily furred bed that had fueled thousands of wild tabloid rumors, his incredibly exhausted heart could not take it anymore. The magnificent, unstoppable force of nature simply stopped moving. The immediate global reaction was a state of absolute, paralyzing shock and deep, profound disbelief. How could the strongest, most physically dominating man to ever walk the polished hardwood floors simply vanish so quietly into the night? News anchors struggled to find the appropriate words, and former bitter rivals openly wept on national television, suddenly realizing that a massive, irreplaceable pillar of their shared history had been abruptly, permanently removed. The sudden departure of the invincible titan completely shattered the deep, comforting illusion that true legends are somehow magically immune to the fragile, temporary nature of human existence. The world mourned not just a phenomenal athlete, but an entire, vibrant era of absolutely unchecked, unapologetic extravagance that he so perfectly, brilliantly embodied. As the heavy initial wave of global mourning slowly began to fade, the complex, highly polarizing legacy of the giant immediately took the center stage. Sports historians frantically tried to steer the public conversation back to his unbelievable, untouchable records, his 100-point game, and his sheer physical dominance on the court. But the relentless, highly fascinated public simply could not look away from that staggering, highly controversial number of 20,000 and the endless, heavily whispered tales of his hidden, mirrored palace. He achieved a deafening success that most mere mortals cannot even begin to comprehend. Yet his incredibly complicated, heavily guarded personal life remains a fascinating, deeply tragic puzzle that continues to absolutely captivate millions of curious minds. And so, as we finally close the heavy velvet curtains on this incredible, massive television investigation, we are left standing in the dark with one final deeply philosophical question that still heavily echoes through the empty, silent halls of his legendary estate. Was this towering, larger-than-life figure truly the most wildly triumphant, completely satisfied conqueror of the 20th century, absolutely living out the ultimate, unrestrained fantasy of absolute power and endless indulgence? Or was he, behind the blinding flashes of the cameras and the loud, endless applause, the most profoundly isolated, deeply lonely soul in modern history, building a massive, glittering mountain of fleeting trophies simply to hide the fact that his massive heart was entirely empty? That, my friends, is the final, greatest secret that the giant took with him into the absolute quiet eternity.